Hi, everyone. My name is Jessica Farrell. I'm a professor in the Department of Pharmacy Practice at Albany College of Pharmacy and Health Sciences, and also a clinical pharmacist at Albany Medical Center, Division of Rheumatology. I worked in rheumatology for about 15 years and love it. I'm also a member of the RAP board, and I'm excited today to talk to you about the Aurora 1 and 2 trials. So we're going to talk about Voclosporin and these two very important trials. So Voclosporin is a newly approved calcineurin inhibitor. We have other calcineurin inhibitors that have been used in lupus nephritis, and Voclosporin is considered a second-generation calcineurin inhibitor with some improved safety profiles. And today we're going to talk about Aurora 1 and 2, which are the two pivotal trials that led to Voclosporin being approved. So the Aurora 1 trial was a multi-center, randomized, placebo-controlled phase 3 trial. The objective was to assess the safety and efficacy of Voclosporin in combination with mycophenolate mofetil and corticosteroids in patients with active lupus nephritis. So historically, these types of trials are fairly challenging to do and to get a large number of patients. So we'll talk about some of the positives to this trial. So patients were randomized to either receive Voclosporin at a dose of 23.7 milligrams twice a day, plus mycophenolate mofetil and corticosteroids, or placebo and mycophenolate mofetil and corticosteroids. And the updated ACR guidelines can call this triple therapy, so the calcineurin inhibitor plus mycophenolate mofetil plus corticosteroids. The primary endpoint of Aurora 1 was to assess the renal response at 52 weeks. And the renal response was defined as a portion of patients who achieved complete renal response. So the complete renal response is defined as a decrease in proteinuria to less than 0.5 grams per day, and a normalization of serum creatinine and stable or improved kidney function overall. Secondary endpoints in Aurora 1 included partial renal response, time to renal response, and safety and efficacy measures like adverse effects and laboratory abnormalities. Just before we move on, I'll just explain the partial renal response. So I'm glad that they include this because the complete renal response is pretty strict criteria, and having the partial renal response is helpful to assess patients who did have improvement, just not a complete renal improvement. So the partial renal response was defined as a 50% or greater reduction in proteinuria from baseline. So this was measured either with the protein to creatinine ratio or a 24-hour urine protein excretion, and stable or improved kidney function measured by the serum creatinine. So the serum creatinine could remain stable or improve from baseline. And this meant that the patients basically didn't have worsening of their kidney function during the study period. So now let's get into the patient population. So there were a total of 357 patients with active lupus nephritis that were enrolled across 130 sites in 23 different countries. The median age was around 37 years old, and the majority of the patients were female, so about 80% were female. And these two characteristics are very consistent to what I see with my patient population with lupus nephritis. And then ethnicity was very diverse. So this is an improvement from some other clinical trials that we have with different therapies for lupus nephritis, because historically it's been hard to get a large enough trial with a diverse enough population. So there were Caucasians, Hispanic, Latinos, Asians, and African Americans included in the clinical trial. Patients' lupus nephritis classification, so most of the patients had class 3 or class 4 lupus nephritis, which are the most severe forms of, or the highest risk to developing kidney damage when they are in those classes. The disease activity for patients, they had to have active lupus nephritis with proteinuria and an elevated serum creatinine at time of enrollment. And then the majority of patients did have a history of, all the patients had a history of lupus nephritis, and most of them had been on immunosuppressants or other therapies before, but they had to have active disease at baseline. So the primary results and key results, so we talked about the renal response. So the complete renal response at 52 weeks in the Voclosporin group was 40.8% of patients that achieved that complete renal response, compared to only 22.5% of those in that placebo group. So that was statistically significant. The partial renal response was also higher in the voclosporin group, so 61.2% achieved a partial renal response compared to placebo, which was a 47.5%. And then the time to response, so voclosporin led to a faster response in many patients where their improvement started within the first 8 weeks of treatment. So that's also really important when we're thinking about sparing a major organ like the kidney. From a safety perspective, the safety profile of voclosporin was consistent with expectations of a calcineurin inhibitor. There were patients that did experience hypertension, some elevated creatinine, headaches, and gastrointestinal side effects, but the serious adverse effects were low and similar between the treatment groups. There was a higher incidence of hypertension in the voclosporin group, which is something that we have to watch out for in our calcineurin inhibitor treated patients, but generally it was manageable with treatment for antihypertensive treatments. So the authors concluded that in the Aurora 1 trial, voclosporin in combination with mycophenolate and corticosteroids was superior to placebo for improving the renal outcomes in patients with active lupus nephritis. They also noted that faster onset of renal response and higher rate of complete renal and partial renal response. It was also generally well tolerated and side effects were manageable. All right, so that's Aurora 1. So I mentioned there's some really great benefits to this trial and positives because it's such a large population, a diverse population. It was a well-done trial, but it was only 52 weeks. So Aurora 2 was a long-term extension trial of Aurora 1. So why is Aurora 2 important? So Aurora 2 was a double-blind placebo-controlled phase 3 study that looked at the long-term safety and tolerability and efficacy of voclosporin in this patient population who completed Aurora 1. So Aurora 1 and Aurora 2 are the largest placebo-controlled trials that we have evaluating a calcineurin inhibitor for lupus nephritis, and also the long-term extension, which includes 3 years of continuous treatment, is also the longest clinical trial that we have to date. Aurora 2, again, was the patients who had completed and participated in Aurora 1, and they were then moved into the observational period for up to 4 years to look at the safety and efficacy. So all those patients who were completed Aurora 1 were eligible for Aurora 2. Those who were on voclosporin in Aurora 1, they stayed on voclosporin therapy, and those who were on placebo switched over to the voclosporin treatment group. The primary objective was, again, to assess the safety long-term and maintenance of renal responses. The secondary endpoints include maintaining renal function, sustained complete renal response, partial renal response over time, and evaluating disease flares and long-term safety. So again, patient population was similar in Aurora 1, so those female populations with a median age around 37, and patients that had class 3 or 4 lupus nephritis. In terms of safety and tolerability, voclosporin was tolerated over the 3-year treatment period, with about 86.2% of patients completing the study. So for that number of patients to complete a long-term extension study does say something to me. It tells me that the patients were able to tolerate therapy and that they could manage to stay on it long term. There were quite a few numbers of adverse events, but most were manageable. And over time, the frequency decreased. So from Aurora 1 to Aurora 2, the frequency of adverse events seemed to decrease. Notably, there were some decreases in GFR and hypertension that were more frequent in the voclosporin group. Those were 10.3% versus 5% for the GFR decrease, and 8.6% versus 7% for the hypertension. But again, these were manageable and didn't lead to unexpected, safety concerns, and they were manageable. The sustained renal response was the patients who achieved a complete renal response or partial in Aurora 1 they generally maintained that renal response over time. So a significant portion of patients were able to maintain that. There was improved proteinuria levels that were in Aurora 1. Those persisted over the 3 years. The complete renal response was more frequent in patients treated with voclosporin compared to the control group. So the 50.9% versus 39.0% with an odds ratio of 1.7. which is statistically significant, demonstrating sustained efficacy. The mean GFR, measured as eGFR, remains stable and within normal range in both treatment groups throughout the study. So the authors looked at the eGFR slope over the 2-year period, which only had a decrease of negative 0.2 mLs per minute per 1.73 meters square, like that was in the voclosporin group, compared to a decrease in the slope of a negative 5.4. So again, that was a significant difference between the difference in slope between the treatment, the voclosporin group, and the placebo group. So the voclosporin group had the renal function that remained stable. Reduced risk of renal flares. So this was also another area. There was a lower number of renal flares seen in the voclosporin group compared to the historical treatment regimen groups. And then from a safety profile, again, we saw those similar safety concerns, but they were generally manageable. Of note, so one of the benefits to a second generation calcineurin inhibitor is that there are less metabolic effects and laboratory abnormalities compared to the first generation calcineurin inhibitors. So there were very few incidents of type 2 diabetes, hyperkalemia, or hyperlipidemia, which is really helpful to know because those are some things that we have to watch out with other calcineurin inhibitors. It's again something that we need to monitor long term, but that is positive to see that they didn't see many of those incidences in this study that was so long. The maintenance of the renal response. So throughout the Aurora 2 extension, patients had improved or stable renal function that remained high throughout the study period, again showing sustained efficacy of voclosporin. And then lastly, from a corticosteroid perspective, so we're always trying to think about ways to be able to decrease steroid use and steroid exposure in our patients. So there was reduced steroid use and dosages overall in the patients with voclosporin group compared to placebo, again, which is helpful to reduce those toxicities from steroids in our patients that we know are going to have to be treated probably with steroids frequently throughout their lifetime. So the Aurora 2 was very helpful in showing this long-term efficacy, giving us good data for a long-term safety profile. One of the things that I always talk to my patients about and the questions that the providers ask me to answer for patients is long-term safety and what should they expect. And this study really did help give us that information. Before we wrap up, I do want to just highlight some of the limitations because every study has limitations. So we talked about some of the adverse events and safety things. So, this is a difficult disease to manage and there are things that we need to watch out for. Obviously, we do need to keep track of GFR, kidney function, events of hypertension, but those are things that we're managing in lupus nephritis anyway. The patients in Aurora 2 that continued from Aurora 1, there was those patients that were transitioned over. There was a lower mean urine protein creatinine ratio in the voclosporin group at the start of Aurora 1. So that might lead to some selection bias as patients in the voclosporin group had to achieve that renal response prior to entering Aurora 2. So, it's a little bit of bias there. But again, this patient population is difficult to study, but just keeping those things in mind, the comparisons between the groups there, we just need to keep that selection bias in mind. So these are the patients who did well during Aurora 1. And then the other piece is, yes, this is 3 years of data, but we need more than 3 years. So most likely our patients with lupus nephritis are going to be on therapy lifetime, so for their whole life. And that's something that we don't have enough data to really be able to tell patients in 10 years, you can expect that you'll still be tolerating this drug the same way, or that we don't really know of what the potential long-term chronic use beyond this 3-4 years of therapy really is. So with that, I hope that you found this helpful. Lupus nephritis studies can be really hard to go through and tease out the nitty-gritty. I hope that I was able to simplify it enough for you and really make it digestible. So for more information related to other things in rheumatology, on lupus nephritis, on Voclosporin, on any of our other therapies, please visit wrap.org or our Wrap ACE app. And thank you for listening, and we'll talk to you soon.